I should say that this lecture was planned to happen in Rome this week, but we're very pleased that we can do it virtually. I won't take up too much of your time. I just want to say that Jason Kelly is Director of the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute and Professor of History in the Indiana University School of Liberal Arts, which is also at IUPUI. He is Fellow of both the Society of Antiquaries and the Royal Historical Society. His publications are many. I just wanted to draw your attention to three. The Society of Dilettanti, Archaeology and Identity in the British Enlightenment, which was published in 2010, and two book projects actually that relate to what we were talking about last week. Editor of Rivers of the Anthropocene, published in 2017, and co-editor of an Anthropocene primer, 2017. So again, I think there's lots of overlap between our talks. Dr. Kelly has received grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, and the Lilly Endowment Incorporation, and the Klaus Foundation. We were just talking before we came live about Jason's most recent project, and it really is recent. He founded the COVID-19 Oral History Project, which he describes as a rapid response research collaboration that archives the lived experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's something you might come back and talk to us about. But I won't delay any longer, but just to say thank you, Jason, with your talk, Approaching Knowledge Networks, Art Academies and the Grand Tour Through the Digital Humanities. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Peter, for the invitation. Like you said, I wish I could have been there in Rome with you, maybe next year. For those of you who are joining us, this lecture was also supposed to be associated with a digital humanities workshop. And so what I've tried to do in this presentation then is blend some elements of that digital humanities workshop together with the talk today. So the purpose of the talk today is to show some of the ways in which digital tools can help us gain greater insight into the 18th century specifically, but also how these tools can open up new areas for research. And the title of my talk is Approaching Knowledge Networks, Art Academies, and the Grand Tour Through the Digital Humanities. And what I'd like to talk about today is three things. First, I want to provide a brief overview of what we mean when we talk about knowledge networks in the early modern period. And I'm particularly interested in looking at one way of thinking about these networks, and that's specifically through the lens of institutions. The second thing I'd like to talk about is how we demonstrate through tools of the digital humanities to help us better understand these knowledge networks. And specifically, I want to do this by looking at 18th century learned societies in their geographical, historical, and social contexts. And finally, turning away from research-specific questions, I want to think about art history pedagogy and the ways that digital humanities might transform what we do in the classroom. And this is particularly important, I would argue, as university positions for early modern art history disappear and as students turn their attention away from early modern art history. So what is a knowledge network? When I refer to knowledge networks, I am speaking of the vast variety of frameworks in which communities create, express, exchange, and critique knowledge. In some instances, knowledge networks can consist of individuals and groups communicating across vast distances. Think, for example, of the correspondence networks of natural philosophers during the early modern period, folks such as Joseph Banks, for example. In most situations, however, knowledge networks are much more localized and context-specific. For example, the knowledge networks of villages and towns that exchange gossip, agricultural news, and folk remedies. Scholars have long recognized the importance of knowledge networks in early modern Europe as central drivers of modernity. They've tried to trace these networks by looking at the correspondence of the idealized Republic of Letters, for example. And they've tried to trace the exchange of knowledge through citations in scientific and literary treatises and through unremarked references in other thinkers' texts. Others have recognized that knowledge networks rely on material infrastructures such as postal systems, coffee houses, and salons, not to mention an unspoken reliance on the extraction of goods and the exploitation of peoples through empire. Today, I want to look into one small but important corner of early modern knowledge networks, and that's specifically the Learned Academy. For the past several years, I have steadily been compiling a database of information related to early modern learned academies and societies. My goal is to build out an open source extensible resource for scholars, something along the lines of Brinsley Ford's Dictionary of British and Irish Travelers, but for learned societies. I've been significantly aided in this task by scholars with similar ambitions, and I want to specifically mention the valuable Italian Academies database, which was published online in 2018. It might be worthwhile to explain what I mean when I'm talking about learned societies before I get started. By learned societies, I'm referring to the thousands of associational groups that emerged between 1400 and 1800. Now, I'm using 1800 as a sort of an arbitrary cutoff point for what early modern is. Now, to qualify for learned society, I think that the primary stated purpose of the group needs to be the exchange of knowledge in some form. This might be through literary and artistic productions, through philosophy, to economics and agriculture, and the sciences more broadly. This is a pretty wide net, and considering that I'm including societies for which sociability may have been more important than education, but I'm leaving out the vast majority of clubs, including those associations focused on charity and mutual support. Likewise, I'm leaving out political clubs, which became more and more prevalent at the end of the 18th century. As we will see, by the end of the 18th century, learned societies were a ubiquitous feature of the social landscape. Not only did nearly every ruler have some kind of royal society or academy, but increasingly provincial societies saw establishing a learned society as central to the civic landscape. Now, widely available digital tools have helped transform what we can do with data about learned societies. And I want to show you a little bit of what we can glean through visualization and historical GIS. So I'm going to switch now so I can share my screen with you. So I'm going to start here with a quick overview of the landscape of learned societies across 5 centuries. The colors that you see here designate the centuries, and as we move from the middle of the graph out, we pass through centuries. The size of each circle represents the number of learned societies created in that century. And as you can see, until the 17th century, it was in the Italian states that the concept of a learned society really took root. Even in the 17th century, only Paris had a substantial number of learned societies, and this was sparked by the work of Colbert and Louis XIV. The 18th century is a different story altogether, as you can see from the graph. What we see are academies popping up all over Europe and even in its colonial possessions. So here's what it looks like using maps. This is the learned societies of the 15th century. Basically, it's in Italy. There's a learned society that pops up in France. But by the 16th century, we see a fairly rapid expansion of learned societies. And of course, these are focused in on the Italian peninsula. By the 17th century, this process continues with kind of an explosion of Italian learned societies. But by the 18th century, as we saw in the last graph, this process changes. It's provinces across Western Europe primarily that sees the efflorescence of learned societies across the landscape. And this is in part due to the expansion of the middle classes and the expansion of print culture. And this is the 18th century in Europe, but if you look across the globe, you can see learned societies that follow the imperial projects of countries such as Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. If we break down things a bit more and we look at the 18th century through its quarterly growth, we see this. This is the first quarter of the century, and we see much of the activity in the major metropoles, except for France, which is seeding academies across the country, which continues in the second portion of the 18th century. But in the second half of the 18th century, this begins to change, and we see an explosion in the German states, as well as the continued spread across France. And of course, finally, we also see these learned societies move into the provincial cities in Britain. Now, the types of the societies over the 18th century were quite varied, both geographically and by topic. While literary and scientific societies continued to be founded, new art academies were being founded across Europe as well. And we see new kinds of learned societies emerge. We see medical societies, the agricultural and economic societies, which are sometimes referred to as patriotic societies. And this expansion of these agricultural and economic societies is linked to the ideas of useful knowledge and utility that were so central to Enlightenment discourse. As you can see here, this is what the rough breakdown of new societies that are founded during the 18th century look like. And this shows to the extent that agricultural and economic and medical societies are on the rise. And this is just a quick map of what the art landscape looks like in the 18th century. I want to step away from the maps now to delve a little bit deeper into the data. And to do this, I'm going to turn away from historical GIS to another digital humanities technique, known as historical social network analysis, or just simply historical network analysis. And I'm going to be showing a number of historical network analysis visualizations so that it can help us better understand how to read them. To help us better understand how to read them, I want to briefly review what historical network analysis is. So using this illustration, what we're looking at is a representation of every known British and Irish artist or architect who traveled to Italy in the period between 1700 and 1770. And specifically, I've tried to attach one of these artists or architects to the workshops or academies in which they trained. I also input all of their teachers, and their fellow students who were trained by their common teachers. And the idea was to create a pedagogical map of British and Irish artists that were trained in trained in Italy, to help us uncover the ways in which artistic knowledge, including taste preferences, might have been structured in the artistic community in Italy. So what you're seeing here in this historical network analysis are two basic building blocks. The circles, or the dots, if they're a little smaller, are known as nodes, and the nodes represent actors. Now, actors are often human, almost in historical social network analysis, almost always human, but not necessarily so. The lines, and they could be curved or straight, in this case they're curved, are called edges. And these edges represent the relationship between two actors or two nodes. And this relationship might be a social relationship, it could be an action. So the very basic element of a social network analysis is two nodes and an edge, the edge creating the relationship between the two actors, the two historical actors. There's a few concepts to keep in mind when it comes to historical social network analysis. First, incompleteness. And you'll see this from the map that you're looking at right now. All data sets, as we know, are selective, but in this work, we're really at the mercy of the sources. If we don't have sources, we don't have a node, we don't have an edge. Secondly, The use of social network analysis is a technique of what we call distant reading. This is a concept that was really articulated well by Franco Moretti. The idea of a distant reading is that we're not necessarily doing the same type of analysis or close reading we might do in a typical historical analysis. A distant reading is not necessarily an exhaustive analysis meant to replace other forms of analysis, but rather it's a complementary form of analysis. In this case, it more easily helps us work across large scale data sets. This is, I think, somewhere along the lines of 400 or 500 nodes in this particular visualization. So it's a lot to handle, and social network analysis helps us do that. At its best, historical or social network analysis and distant reading might reveal things that we didn't know, but at the very least, it can help us confirm hunches. It can provide one piece in a set of supporting data and supporting analysis. In addition to incompleteness and distant reading, another thing that we might think of when we think about historical social network analysis is relationships. I've already mentioned this, but what we're looking at are relationships among people, places, and things, and trying to better understand how these relationships work. And one concept that often comes up in this relationship analysis is the concept of centrality. And simply put, centrality is looking at how a node might be central in a larger network. And you're looking at a few centralized nodes here. The Royal Academy of Arts in London, the Virtuosi of St. Luke. These are areas where lots of other nodes are connected through lots of edges. Now, while some historical social network analysis is highly statistical, it doesn't necessarily have to be so. And likewise, some data sets are quite large. For example, the 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon's mining of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, but it doesn't necessarily have to be large. Social network analysis is quite good, as you can see here, at presenting structures through relationships, but it's a bit more challenging using historical social network analysis to map historical change or temporal change. It's not that it can't be done, it's just a bit more difficult. So the key is to make sure that when you're doing historical social network analysis is to know what the time spans are and making sure that they are relevant to the questions at hand. You'll note in this example, I'm not particularly concerned with time, but rather I'm more concerned with structure. Now, let's talk about types of networks. This is the same data that you saw in the previous image. It's just run through a different algorithm that groups things differently. I want to talk about closed networks versus open networks. Closed networks are those in which actors primarily interact with each other within a social group. These can be dense networks with lots of actors who know each other, and this is why the network tends to be closed. They tend to show up as clusters in the data, and they are different than open networks, which obviously are a bit more likely, consisting of individuals who are more likely to engage with others. And when you're looking at this image here, and this is why I wanted to show this particular visualization, is when we look at the Virtuosi of St. Luke that looked so central in the previous visualization, it's fairly clear that this is actually a relatively closed network, at least with the data set that we're looking at. Those individuals are not part of the larger Italian-based social network of individuals that we have. Now, the reason for paying attention to the density of networks emerges from the sociological theory of strong and weak ties. Strong ties are often built over long periods and are characterized by familiarity and trust among individuals and groups, and they often share common knowledge. Weak ties are those social relationships without a lot of these bonds. They tend to be more porous, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In the seminal article, The Strength of Weak Ties by Mark Granovetter, he made the case for the importance of weak ties as essential in opening up space in a cluster that might connect to denser networks. And as other scholars have elaborated this idea, it's in these openings that new ideas can be created and exchanged. So if we look at this graph, what is it telling us? Well, it's telling us the significance of the Royal Academy, for one. This isn't surprising, but what it also tells us, if we look at the bigger context, is that it's not necessarily an influence on our artists, because this map ends in 1770, but rather it's made up of the artists who traveled to Italy. Secondly, if we look at the virtuosi of St. Luke, this is that closed off group, and Italy may have been a destination for folks in this group, but it wasn't necessarily a destination in which there was a lot of engagement with these other groups. If we look at the Florentine Accademia del Disegno, this was looks like it's more important than the Accademia di San Luca. But when you look at the data a little more closely, artists who were traveling to Italy, British and Irish artists who were traveling to Italy, who were getting elected to the Accademia di San Luca, getting elected to the Accademia del Disegno, were often doing it on their way out of the city. It was almost like a credential that they could be used, back home. If we strip out institutional associations, we find that the relationship shifts substantially back to Rome, and we see Roman-based artists primarily represented in the data set. This is all to take you through these three graphs, which effectively have all of the same data, how important it is to inquire about the visualizations that we're looking at, but also the power of those visualizations to point us in new directions. Now, one of the valuable aspects of historical social network analysis is the capacity that it gives us to look at multiple scales. It can shift the focus of our questions, or simply allow us to experiment with technology to see what might emerge. So let's drill down just a little bit further into the data and look at one of the artists that showed up in the last illustration. James Russell arrived in Rome in 1740 and lived his life there until he died in Rome in 1763. And while he was there, he became one of the most important guides and agents and antiquaries in all of Rome. And for those of you who have done any work on the Grand Tour, you've probably come across his letters, dozens of which survive in printed and manuscript form. And this is actually a visualization of those letters that he sent out and were received by him. They give us some sense of his correspondence network, but what they don't give us a sense of is his network in Rome. So basically, this is what we're looking at here is the metadata of the letters, but it doesn't reference the context within the letters. But if we extract the names within the letters and code them, it allows us to see a much richer network. It also demonstrates centrality. It's maybe not surprisingly, James and his father are central to the networks. The letters reveal limited interconnections between those mentioned in the letters, unfortunately. But for those people who it does mention, and those people who are connected to other people, there are some tantalizing suggestions in this visualization. Let's look at Richard Meade, for example. We know that Richard Meade was an avid collector and that he traveled to Rome in the late 17th century. If we look at the art sale that that was done after he died in the middle of the 18th century, we can look and see all of the artists whose art he owned that lived at the same time he lived. In other words, this is a list of artists who are contemporary to Richard Meade, who he may have met in person or on the Grand Tour. And we can use this perhaps as proxy for Richard Meade's connections to the contemporary art world. And when we map out Richard Meade's, we know that Meade provided an introduction to Russell to meet James Russell, to meet Antonio Cocchi, as well as to study with, I'm sorry, this is a second image of where the art came from that was in Meade's collection. Russell was to study with Antonio Cocchi, who Richard Meade introduced him to, as well as Pederni in Rome. Again, Meade sent a letter of introduction to those two individuals. And so when we map out Richard Meade's social network, again, using his collection of art as a proxy for folks who he may have been in contact with, we begin to see that there seems to be a potential social network emerging, which if we probe further might lead to new discoveries. And you can see this social network emerging around James Russell on one end of this social network graph, his father, and mutual connections between Richard Meade and the Russells. There is some element of Jacobitism in this group, but there's also a connection to a number of Italian artists, and even a famous Italian physician, and not inconsequentially, James's brother was a physician. Now I want to turn to a final graph. I'm not going to keep showing you more graphs. This represents a first pass at mapping the membership of some of the larger learned societies in London. This data here includes the entire membership of the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries, the Society of Dilettanti between 1700 and 1770, against some smaller associations which some of these members were involved with, such as the Egyptian Society. And what we see here in the outer clusters are actually relatively closed networks. These are folks that are engaging with each other, but not necessarily engaging with the other associations. In the middle of this graph, we can see the overlaps, where the cultural brokers are, those who bridge intellectual worlds. And it's in this middle section where we can start to see some of the ways that sociability and social clubs bridge the domains of natural philosophy, belles lettres, and the arts. And this is just one sampling of that middle area, looking at individuals who traveled to the Ottoman Empire during this period and were members of the multiple clubs represented in that larger visualization. And studying the nature of these interstitial sites is a central key, I think, to understanding early modern knowledge networks. Now, in the third and final portion of my talk, I want to briefly engage with a third form of digital humanities scholarship. As I mentioned in my opening comments, this section's focused on research-led pedagogy. This isn't on research that I lead, but rather it's a project that's under the umbrella of the research institute that I direct, or I should say, the research institute I direct, the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, is one of the institutes involved in the project, which is the Great Marble Map of Rome project, a collaboration between the Ancient World Mapping Center at UNC Chapel Hill and the Musei Capitolini. The IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, the IUPUI University Library, IUPUI Center for Digital Scholarship are supporting the work of these other organizations. Originally, some of the team members were going to be with me in Rome. You would have all had the opportunity to put on virtual reality goggles and engage with what I'm about to show you. So I apologize for it not being as exciting as it might be. You will just have to trust me. It's exciting, and I will bring the equipment with me next time I come to Rome. The Great Marble Map of Rome project intends to take high-quality 3D scans of the Severan map of Rome, which was originally in the Forum. How good these scans are it's really impressive. This device here allows the folks who are scanning these thousands of pieces of marble that show the map of Rome at 16K by 16K pixels. It takes 1,000 photographs per second, and it's a handheld device. And this is actually the device or devices in action last summer in Rome when we were still able to travel there. And you can see the pieces of marble being scanned. The team has, at this point, scanned all of the known pieces of marble map that are inscribed. But I'm not going to talk about the scanning technology here. Rather, I'm more interested in showing you what the team has done with the scans that they've created. They've created a 3D environment in which you can go inside and physically—
what you see here is the photograph—
physically manipulate the objects in a virtual reality space. So on the bottom left here, you can see my colleague Liz Phil, who leads the project at IUPUI and is the brains behind this entire operation of creating these 3D environmental or 3D environments. And as you can see here, this is a photorealistic scan in the virtual environment. And these are pieces of the marble map that when you're in the environment, you can actually go in and interact with them and move them about and investigate them very closely. If you remember, that's a very high resolution on many of these pieces, a higher resolution than we've been able to do before. And I'm going to jump ahead just a wee bit here in the video. And what you can see happening is within this virtual reality environment, you can manipulate the map and you can actually drop the pieces to scale as you put the pieces together and project it onto the side of the wall at the same scale that you would have seen in the original. So you can effectively, to some extent, go back in time and look at these items. So basically what the team at IUPUI is beginning to do, and you can see the map on the wall there, and there you can see the pieces placed on the map on the wall. So you can see how the scale of this is just incredible. Now, what the team at IUPUI is building is a fully immersive 3D environment in which scholars, students, and the public can interact with the map. Now, as you can see here, you can actually take these pieces and begin to mark them up. You can mark them up with color. You can mark them up with text. You can basically embed metadata in the objects themselves. And if I jump ahead just a little bit, you'll be able to see that you're actually standing on top of the marble slab itself. This is where this project gets really interesting. What the team is beginning to do is using these 3D scanned objects and taking these 2D maps and turning them into 3 dimensions. They're beginning to populate the locations according to the outlines on the map itself. If you're looking at this map, this is, imagine yourself on the marble slab. You're looking above at the marble slab, and that is a house that has been built to match what is inscribed on the stone, on the marble itself. I'm going to jump ahead here, and you can see what you're looking at. You can see the entrance. The entranceways are on the map, and as you move into the project, you can actually enter 3D recreations of the Great Marble Map of Rome. I really love looking at this VR project and imagining what Piranesi would have done if he had access to this technology. But when you think about what we're looking at here in the context of art history pedagogy, this type of work has the power to transform how we teach. Imagine teaching the Grand Tour and being able to virtually compare Piranesi's engravings to the 3D objects themselves. Imagine having the capacity to teach students about visual theory and material culture and giving them the ability to pick objects up and move them around. Imagine giving students 18th century texts and then asking them to rebuild a museum collection or to design an interior according to 18th century aesthetic principles. The possibilities here are really limited to our own imaginations. Now, in this presentation, I've offered just a glimpse at a few of the digital humanities tools that are increasingly becoming easier and user-friendly. I don't want to suggest that DH is an answer to all of our research questions or educational questions or even necessary in many scholarly projects. That said, I think that there's potential in these technologies to open up new paths for inquiry. For example, if you think back to the historical social network visualizations that I presented in the first portion of this presentation, I'm thinking about these as part of a multi-layered project. After building up the membership of artistic workshops, of academies, of societies, mapping their interconnections, I'm beginning to ask questions about the ways that these networks shaped taste and patronage across vast distances. How, for example, Italy shaped British and Irish habits, expectations, consumption, and patronage patterns, and vice versa. It's possible that the interstitial spaces of weak ties that I showed in the visualization hold insights into micronetworks and local knowledge and behaviors in the 18th century. And despite the amazing work that's been done by 18th century scholars over the past decade, I think the digital tools have the capacity, and I think they're already doing it, to open up new fields of inquiry that have the potential to shed new light on the period of the 18th century. So, thank you.